All right, are we good to go? Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for being here. This is a public meeting for what is basically the EPA Brownfield Multipurpose Grant application. It's somewhat of a continuation of a process that began in 2018, and I'll get a little bit into that soon. But really appreciate you being here. This is a meeting that hopefully we'll get feedback from all of you, and hopefully some people volunteering to help with what we've got going on. So let's get into it. This is our agenda tonight. We're going to talk about the sign-in sheet that you just did, and we'll get into some introductions as well. Purpose of the meeting, I'll go over the 2018 Coalition Brownfield Assessment Grant that preceded this one. And then Dave Laney, who is our consultant up here, he will get into the current application and our vision for the entire project. And then after that, we'll get a little Q&A. So I would anticipate about an hour to an hour and a half of this meeting. It shouldn't really take all of that long. But for introductions, the grant team is made up really of three people. You've got myself. My name is Rick Harmon. I'm the Economic Development Manager. Brandy Fowler is sitting over there. She's the grant manager, grant writer for the city, doing an absolutely phenomenal job bringing in funds into this community. And then we have Dave Laney, who is smiling there with the white beard, who is our consultant and really doing the brunt of the work on the application. Dave is very familiar with our area. He's very familiar with the last grant that's currently still in implementation. So it's a natural step for him to proceed into this and progress into this grant as well. Sign-in sheets. I assume you all signed in. If you didn't, please do. If you do, and you can provide us with your email address, we would like to send you a link that has a survey on it to ask you how you might want to be involved with this project. Part of the purpose of this is to bring on stakeholders, bring on people who are willing to help us in one way or another, whether that be on a committee or whether that be providing food for meetings or something like that. The EPA wants to know that we have a good collaboration going on in the community, and it's very well supported. So if you can provide your email address, we'll get you a link after the meeting to sign up if you're interested. So the purpose of this meeting. Why are you here? Why did we invite people? We invited I'd say about 40 people, different organizations, different interests, people we might consider stakeholders, people we might consider affected by this project. We are talking primarily now, the main site that we're looking at is the Skyline Steel property on 1st Street along the river. And that will, if provided you're working on doing some environmental cleanup, there could, in the off chance, be some runoff in the water that could affect a neighboring landowner. So we tried to bring in some people who have an interest in it one way or another, whether you're involved with the river, whether you're an area landowner, whether you're involved with Black Hills Energy, whether are interested in it. We really want to get some feedback and some support from you. We also need possible locations. One of the possibilities of this grant is that we can choose more locations within our area to do assessments. And I'll get into what we're looking at in a little bit, and so will Dave. Suggestions, concerns, of course, the city is hugely into communication. I know that's not necessarily believed out there, but there's a huge focus on communication. And so these meetings are very, very vital. They're not just mandatory, but they're vital in our community as well. And then, like I said before, encourage and enlist community involvement. How do you want to be involved? And that's where that survey will come in a little bit later on. So what is a brownfield? Brownfields are real property, the expansion or redevelopment or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence of or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. In other words, we're trying to make property that is considered dangerous or has a stigma attached to it because it might have some environmental contamination, trying to make it property that's developable, that an investor might be interested in developing. And that's really what a brownfield is. So, and And that's the priority of this project and every other brownfield, is to clean up the land or assess if it needs to be cleaned up. A little bit of background. I mentioned before that this is somewhat of a continuation. There was a 2018 Fremont County Coalition assessment grant that's still in the process, that's done a number of assessments and a number of cleanups of sites. It included Fremont County, Canyon City, Florence, and Fremont Economic Development Corporation, and focused on, what is that, about 9 sites? 10?
About a dozen.
About a dozen sites that have either been assessed or evaluated one way or another. Some have gone through phase 1 and phase 2. We are going to focus this project primarily on the Skyline Steel site. And then we will also include Black Hills Energy, should that need to be assessed and managed or cleaned up by us. And then there are a number of other properties that we're going to include in this as well. But this ties in very closely to previous plans. So we are looking at this general area, and there's a bigger picture here too. Skyline Steel properties right here. This is just a concept that was done in 2017 for the Arkansas River Corridor Master Plan. This project is really a continuation of a number of projects, a number of studies that have been done that all pointed to the need to work on the riverfront in town. Here we have a bigger picture. You can take a look at this later on if you want to. I can also print this off if you want it, but this is in no way a plan. This is just a concept of what the area could look like. And these are the plans that all reference doing work on the river corridor. All of these plans, or several of them, are on that table over there if you're interested in taking a look at them. But they all reference, to some extent, the need to work on the river. So this really is putting a plan into action and going to the next step of cleaning up Skyline Steel site in order to make it available for development. So I will hand it over to Dave. Dave Laney is our engineer from Stantec. He will tell you about this project, and we'll have a Q&A after that. So let me turn off my share. And Dave, you are good to go.
All right. Thank you, Rick. Can you all see that? Rick? Hello, Rick?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, good. So as Rick said, my name is Dave Lane. I work for Stantec. We're a consultant to the city. We're responsible for assisting Fremont County and the Fremont County Coalition in implementation of the 2018 Brownfield Assessment Grant from EPA that Rick talked about a little bit earlier. So that's part of the reason we're here. This is what I do for a living. Work on brownfields all the time, and there will be a little bit of duplication with Rick, but not with some of what he said, but not a whole lot. But this is one thing that's really important: is what is a brownfield? And as Rick said, the key to this definition is that it doesn't have to be, a brownfield doesn't have to be contaminated property. It can simply be property where there's the perception of contamination. A lot of times we're talking property that's been abandoned, is vacant, is underutilized, and nobody knows the history of it. So in that particular case, there's a stigma attached, as Rick said. There's some unknowns, some uncertainty, and that's what investors and developers don't like. They want to know exactly how much it's going to cost to buy a property and put something on the property, or to take an old building and remodel it. And in brownfield, sometimes, a lot of times, you may not know that. Here are some examples of some of the more traditional brownfields like dry cleaners, old gas stations, manufacturing facilities, auto repair facilities. But then we also find that there are brownfields that include things like underutilized parking lots, railroad tracks, junkyards, schools, and churches. We actually do a lot of work looking for asbestos and lead-based paint in schools and churches using brownfield grant money. But you get the idea that it's a pretty broad definition, and EPA wrote the definition to be as broad as possible because they wanted to include a lot of these kinds of sites that may fall through the cracks. One of the reasons why brownfields are important for purposes of getting an assessment and cleanup is because we do find contamination in about 30% of the cases. That's a number that EPA actually has put out there. It's not published, but they say it frequently in presentations. 30% of the brownfields have some sort of contamination, and sometimes it's harmful to health. We see gasoline on some of these sites. Gasoline has benzene. Benzene is a known human carcinogen. We also get lead from leaded gasoline that people don't use anymore, but it sticks around in the environment. It's very persistent in the environment. So if you have a site that's next to a roadway, sometimes you get lead from leaded gasoline that cars used to have when they went down that roadway. Also lead-based paint from old buildings, even buildings that aren't around if they were torn down and some of the debris was left on site. We find lead in the soil from the lead-based paint. Sometimes we see pesticides, which have a number of health issues if they're too high a concentration. Sometimes we see arsenic. All of these things, and sometimes other things as well, other contaminants like PCBs or other types of metals can represent health hazards at brownfield sites. Another reason why brownfields are important is because they tend to be more prevalent in areas where there are low-income populations, minority populations, areas where there might be food deserts or food insecurity, and medically underserved areas. So some cities use brownfields as a way to address some of these issues. For example, if you're in a food desert, some cities try to bring a grocery store in and develop a brownfield with a new grocery store to help address food insecurity. As far as brownfields and their effect on a neighborhood and the difficulty of dealing with brownfields, if you're a government, there are a number of issues. Safety, crimes and gangs, illegal dumping. We find that a lot of these brownfields tend to be an attractive nuisance. So folks will drive in the middle of the night and dump there. Sometimes there's drug activity on the sites. And oftentimes the site is not well maintained. You might have an out-of-state landowner who's not mowing the grass or taking care of weeds or maintaining a building. And we've seen instances where that happens, and there's actually arsonists who look at these sites as a fun playground for them to come and create havoc. So there's some definite issues as far as the way these sites make the entire neighborhood look. And developers, I mentioned earlier, developers avoid brownfields because of unknown costs and unknown timeframes for for development. Sometimes if a developer buys a brownfield, there are some liability issues. Sometimes there's no clear title. There's occasionally old infrastructure associated with brownfields because some of these are in the center of town, and the infrastructure, the water, sewer, roads have been there for a long time and they haven't been maintained, or in some cases there is no infrastructure, which is also a problem for developers. So a lot of times developers prefer to go to the outskirts of town, build in the suburbs rather than take on a brownfield because of some of these issues. One question that you may have is whether there are brownfields in Canyon City. And the answer to that is yes. This is an inventory that we did originally for the Fremont County Brownfield Coalition grant, but it's been updated for this particular grant. And you can see that state of Colorado says that there are 182 potential brownfield sites in the city. EPA has about 288 properties that might be brownfields where there's a record of some sort of environmental activity there. Could be something very innocuous, could be that somebody needed to pull a permit to get rid of a 5-gallon bucket of paint or something like that. But it also could be that a business was generating hazardous waste. It could be that there was a leaking underground storage tank from an old gas station, or an underground storage tank that was leaking from a dry cleaner. A lot of those buildings, a lot of those businesses do have to report to the state or to EPA. And so this is one way that we look to see if there are brownfields present. One other thing that happened in Canyon City is that there were a number of older industrial businesses, particularly in the riverfront area, starting in the late 1800s. So there's at least one smelter. There was a coal-fired power plant that operated for 115 years. There was lumber mills. There were brick manufacturing facilities. There were numerous industrial businesses that left behind brownfields. They're not there anymore. A lot of times you can't even tell where they were exactly, but you go back to some of the historical records and they definitely left a mark on the area. So let's talk about grants and why we're having this meeting. A long time ago, the U.S. Conference of Mayors was struggling with brownfields, and they went to Congress and they said, we really need some money to help deal with some of these abandoned, vacant, and contaminated properties. And so EPA, about 20 years ago, set up a brownfield program, and as part of that, they came up with a variety of different grants. So that this just kind of shows the universe here of EPA grants that are available for folks that have brownfields. They've got job training grants. They've got what's called a targeted brownfield assessment, where EPA will bring their own contractors out and will do some work on a property. They've got revolving loan fund grants. If a city wanted to loan money to businesses to clean up a property, EPA will provide that city money, and then the business can get a loan from the city to do that work. But what we're going to be talking about today is assessment and cleanup, and how EPA's grants are structured to address those two issues, and in particular, how the multi-purpose grant that Canyon City is pursuing addresses assessment and cleanup. So traditionally, EPA has had 3 different kinds of assessment grants. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but in general, the amount of money that a city could get to assess brownfield properties varies from $300,000 to $600,000. And I've highlighted the coalition grant on this slide because that's the type of brownfield assessment grant that Fremont County got back in 2018 that the city has used to some extent on Skyline Steel. And it's been a good grant. I think Florence used it as well. And several private property owners use money from that grant. So that's a great way to go if you need to do assessment. And as you can see at the bottom of this slide, this year there's something like 87 of these grants that EPA plans to award nationwide for $32 million. EPA also has cleanup grants. With the cleanup grant, you can get up to $500,000 per site. The problem is that you have to own the site. You also have to put up 20% of the cost as cost sharing or a cost match. And these grants are only 3 years in duration. But they put out quite a few of them. This says 26 cleanup grants will be awarded this year for a total of $13 million. That's nationwide. What's better than either the cleanup or the assessment grant is a multi-purpose grant. And that's the type of grant that Canyon City is applying for this year. Rather than the $300,000 to $600,000 that is offered with a traditional assessment grant, or the $500,000 if you get a cleanup grant, multi-purpose grants are for $800,000, and they let you do both assessment and cleanup. And in particular with Skyline Steel, the cleanup part of this grant is going to be really important because some assessment, a lot of assessment has already been done out there. So the bulk of what remains is cleanup. The other good part about this grant, aside from that it's more money, is that it's for a 5-year duration. Both the assessment grants that EPA offers and the cleanup grants that EPA offers, those are only 3 years in duration. Now there is a pretty sizable match here, but we've done some calculations, and over the 5-year term, assuming that the city wants to make an in-kind contribution, donate some staff time, which is going to equal something less than like 8 hours a week, they can make this match, this $40,000 match, without too much effort, and EPA will allow that. So I think that's you know, it sounds like a lot of money, but over the course of 5 years, it's not a significant burden. Now, one thing about the multi-purpose grant, and one reason why we're having this meeting, is that there aren't very many of them. These are not offered every year. They're offered every other year, and EPA only awards 10 of them in the entire country. And so what we have to do is we have to make the grant application that is being put together right now and is going to be submitted to EPA on October 27th or 28th. We have to make that as good as possible. We have to make it bulletproof. We have to get as close to 100% of the points on that as possible, because there are going to be a lot of other folks throughout the U.S. that are applying for these same multi-purpose grants. Just so you know, one of the things that can be done with the multi-purpose grant is that it can be used for a lot of different things. I mentioned assessment and cleanup. Those certainly are the two primary activities, but If Canyon City needs to, they can also do some more inventory work to make sure that they know of all the potential brownfields in the riverfront area. They obviously will have to do public outreach and engagement, and that's something that they're looking forward to. The traditional assessment work is called phase 1 or phase 2. Phase 1 is just historical records review and interviews of property owners. The phase 2, you actually go out and collect samples. In addition to that, you can do asbestos and lead-based paint surveys on buildings with this grant. And you can do planning, remediation planning, as well as property cleanup. So if Canyon City needs to have somebody draw up some, put together some drawings or some specifications for a contractor, telling them exactly how to go about doing the cleanup and where the contamination is, what to do with any sort of residual that results from the cleanup process, so forth and so on. This grant will pay for it. So it's again, it's a pretty good grant. And one thing that we're looking at doing is not only specifying that this money will be spent in the riverfront area, but as needed, it can and probably will be spent to some extent in downtown Canyon City. That's the riverfront is the primary target area, but downtown Canyon City is also the target area that's identified in the grant. So Canyon City knows that that area has some properties that need some of this work, and some of this money can be used down there in downtown as needed. A couple of points to keep in mind. Communities overall these days do not have money and resources to deal with brownfields. So these grants are great in that they provide money and resources that the city of Canyon City would not have. It would have to be money that would be taken away from an existing program if this grant was not awarded. It also, when these grants exist, it helps to encourage developers to take some risk and to move forward with development of properties that they ordinarily wouldn't even touch. So that's extremely important. And it helps with business attraction and business retention. It helps with investment. A lot of times investors are not interested in cities that have a lot of brownfields or in neighborhoods that have a lot of brownfields. But if you will find that if you spend money from one of these grants and you clean up some brownfield properties, all of a sudden the situation looks a lot different to investors and developers. In fact, as this slide says, EPA has done studies on this, and they have determined that the return on investment with one of these grants is pretty significant. Specifically, for every $1 of EPA grant money that's invested on a brownfield, $18 of private investment on average gets invested. In addition to that, jobs do created. There are 8,000 jobs on average that get created for every, this says 1.5 billion, I think that's 1.5 million in redevelopment funds. So that's not an insignificant amount. And most importantly, for some folks that have residential property, property values go up when brownfield properties get redeveloped by 5 to 15%. And it's not just the brownfield property itself or the properties next door. They've determined that properties as far away as four blocks from the brownfield site actually see increased property value. Which brings me to the last slide in my presentation, and that is, why are we here? Why are we talking about this? Well, quite simply, we need your help. The EPA requires project partners to be identified in the brownfield grant application. Without project partners, and that would be both individuals and organizations who'd be willing to help make the grant a success over the next 5 years, provide input into plans for assessment, cleanup, and redevelopment of these brownfield properties. EPA will not provide this money to Canyon City. That's a requirement, and it has to be spelled out pretty clearly in the grant application who in Canyon City wants to step up and help the city secure these funds. As I said, this includes planning and implementation, cleanup and assessment, or assessment and cleanup. But it also is the money is going to be spent on public meetings, open houses, workshops, and forums. There will be a Brownfield Advisory Committee that's formed. There will be a lot of opportunity for citizens to have input into the process. So what we're looking for, as Rick said at the beginning, is we're looking for folks who'd be willing to fill out the survey and say what they might be willing to commit to as far as support for this grant. Could be you've got a nice meeting room and you'd be willing to make it available for public meetings. Could be, you want to buy food for the meeting. Could be that you just are willing to pass out flyers to the organization that you belong to, or talk to your friends and neighbors about the grant, what's being done with it, when and where meetings are going to be held, that kind of thing. Or you might want to get more involved. You might want to be a member of the Brownfield Advisory Committee. They don't meet a lot, 2 to 3 times a year, but their input is extremely valuable. So that's on the survey. The question is whether or not you might be interested in that. And it's not a hard and fast commitment. Once the grant gets awarded, anybody that says they're willing to help support the effort, we'll get back to you and ask you if you're still interested. Sometimes people's circumstances change. You're not as available as you used to be, or maybe you thought you were interested, but you changed your mind. That happens. But what we're looking for right now, tonight and over the next couple of days, is to get as many people as we can to sign up to show support for the grant. So I hope that you all are see the value in the Brownfield Multipurpose Grant, and you will help us move forward to put together a very competitive grant application.
All right, if anybody has any questions for Dave or me, he's the authority. He's the knowledgeable one, but let me know. I'll have to pass around the microphone. We have people on Zoom and people on Facebook watching, so if you just speak up now, they won't hear you, so I'll hand you the microphone.
Can we make this shareable so that we can pass it around social media so we can get some volunteers? Is that possible?
Yeah, that's not a problem at all. Can you send me your slide deck, Dave?
Yes, absolutely.
And we can combine them into one. Yeah, I can do that. That's not a problem. Anybody else? How about anybody on Facebook or Zoom? Christy, I assume you're there.
I am. We don't have any questions right now, but I just asked and let everyone know if they do have any questions to go ahead and ask them in the comments.
Okay. So as you can see, we need some assistance. This is a very competitive grant. This is, you know, you think about the different grants he talked about, the cleanup grant, which is a 3-year grant, the assessment grant, which is a 3-year grant. The possibility of, you know, we went with a multi-purpose even though it's more competitive because of the possibilities of extending it out 5 years, and right at this point, we don't necessarily have all of that much to clean up. So if you have a grant that you don't use in the 3-year time period, you lose it. Multi-purpose at least gives us a chance to assess more properties or at least evaluate whether they need assessment. And then if we need more cleanup, we can do more cleanup after that. The Black Hills site, that's a little complicated right now. It's in negotiations between Black Hills and Colorado Legacy Land. Colorado Legacy Land is the company that now owns the property where the Cotter Mine was, and they are working on that cleanup. And if all goes according to plan, they will have the Black Hills, they will do the cleanup, and they will help do a somewhat of a development plan for it. And then it would transfer, I believe, back into city hands at that point. So that's a little more complicated. If that all falls apart, then we have the multipurpose to do the assessment and the cleanup. We really don't know what that's going to entail. I mean, there's people that say don't drill down 3 feet. There's people that say don't do anything, just bring in top fill. But we won't know until we know, you know. So that's the complicating factor. Yeah.
How is that related to the 13 acres that Black Hills Energy owns in the center of Pueblo, Trinidad?
This doesn't affect that at all. And I don't know about the Colorado Legacy Land negotiations. I really don't know about that.
The Black Hills Energy land that's being obtained.
You're talking in Trinidad or? This grant will only affect the Canyon City property if it affects the Canyon City property at all. The Colorado Legacy Land deal? Yeah, I can't speak to that. I just don't know about that acreage. Any other questions?
What is the timeline for getting the application in?
Dave, you want to take that?
Yeah, the application is supposed to be submitted on the 28th of October in order to make sure that it goes in smoothly, since it does involve the federal government. We'll probably work on submitting the grant a day or two early. The surveys and expressions of support and commitment for the grant, we'd like to have, I think by no later than end of the day Monday. So if you can fill out the surveys today, that's great. If not, you got a couple more days, but because we've got to submit the grant application fairly soon, we'd rather not wait until the last minute to try to get surveys in.
If you were on the invitation list, you received an email. You should have received an email yesterday, I believe, with the link to the survey. If you did not receive it, then the email addresses you have on the sheet you gave us on the sheet back there, the sign-in sheet, we'll use those and send you the links. But however you can participate would be great. It is a mandate, it's required. And the more we can show support for the grant, the more we can hopefully increase our success of receiving it. Only 10 in the country, so we put it out there and see what we can do. But the better we can do in the involvement and support, the better the application looks. Any other questions here? I've got nothing else, Dave.
Okay.
Anything else for Christy?
I don't have any on my end.
All right. And Dave, you want to add anything else?
No, I just, I appreciate everybody's time showing up and/or participating online. It's one of the things that really makes a big difference, not just in this phase of these projects, but moving forward with implementing the grant once the money is awarded. So hopefully this is just the start of some, a period of great success for the city, doing some fantastic work in the riverfront area over the next 5 years. And I hope everybody can come along for the ride, because I think it should be a really exciting and dynamic project going forward.
It is a very exciting time. One of the things that one person who's not here is the city administrator, Ryan Stevens. He used to be the economic development director before me, but we now have a staff of 3 in economic development. We have myself and Brandy, and then Tom Dixon, who's back there as our Main Street program manager. Works mostly with the smaller businesses closer to downtown, but not just downtown. But if you have any questions or want to talk about anything afterward, we'll be here for a few minutes, and we'll answer your questions if we can. Really appreciate you coming along and seeing what's going on and your support. And if you have any questions, my card is back there. Feel free to call me. Prefer to call the cell phone because my desk phone just generally gets me nothing. I get more spam calls on my desk phone, so I let those go to voicemail. So call my cell phone. My email address is on the card as well. I'm always open to talk about it. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks, Dave.
Sure. Thank you.